Hello and welcome to the World Economic Forum in Geneva, Switzerland. My name is Adrian Monk, and joining me for today's launch of the Global Gender Gap Report is Sadia Zahidi, the report's author, but also joining us we have the Honourable Zainab Shamsuna Ahmed from Nigeria, who is Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning. We have Wipro's CEO and Managing Director, Thierry Delaporte. And from LinkedIn, we have their Head of Global Public Policy and Economic Graphing, Sue Duke. So we have a great group to discuss the findings of this year's Global Gender Gap Report. But to start us rolling, I want to introduce the report's lead and author, Sadia Zahidi, to tell us some of the headlines from the 2022 Global Gender Gap Report. Sadia, over to you.
Thanks very much, Adrian. And I'd just like to acknowledge that there's actually quite an extensive team that is involved with this set of work, and I'm one of the authors of the report. Okay, so 146 countries covered this year. Number one in the world, Iceland, having closed just over 90% of its gender gap. And 146th in the world, Afghanistan, which has closed just over 44% of its gender gap. So a huge diversity across those countries, and yet none has actually reached parity, even though Iceland and other Nordic countries are doing fairly well. A second key takeaway, the way we build this index, we look at education, we look at health, we look at economic participation, and we look at political empowerment. When it comes to health, about 96% of that gender gap has been closed. When it comes to education, about 94%. When it comes to economic participation, just over 60%. And when it comes to political empowerment, only about 22%. Third, we've been doing this for about 16 years, and if we continue at the current pace of change that we've tracked over the last decade and a half, it will take 132 years to get to parity across this combined set of countries and this combined set of data. Now, that was at about 100 years just before the pandemic, and so the pandemic and its disruptions have added essentially a couple of generations to the time it will take to reach parity. Thanks, Adrian.
Thanks, Sadia. Sue Duke, you're with LinkedIn, and LinkedIn has some unique insights into the world of pay and some of the facts and figures that sit behind this report. Can you share some of the key insights with us? Sue, I'm not sure if we're hearing you.
Is that any better?
That's much better.
Sorry, Adrian. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here this morning with you all. The findings and the data in today's report are very, very clear. Even in good times, work has not been working for women as well as it has been for men. But as Sadia pointed out there, especially in bad times when there are health, economic or other shocks to the system, it's women who take the biggest hit. At LinkedIn, we've been using our unique insights drawn from our 830 million members worldwide to study these trends. And there's a couple of key findings I'd call out this morning, Adrian. The first is leadership. The good news here is the numbers are going in the right direction. We've seen the annual share of women hired into leadership roles go from 33% 5 years ago to 37% in 2022. The bad news is we are still way off where we need to be. Women today make up just 31% of leadership roles globally, and there is not a single country and there is not a single industry that has achieved gender parity in leadership. So those numbers need to go way up and fast. Second, why is it that those numbers are so low? One of the great things about LinkedIn's insights is we can use them to really pinpoint exactly where it is that men and women's careers diverge. And there are two key areas in the report that I think are worth calling out. One, getting into that first manager role, and two, getting an internal promotion. We can think of that first management role as the entry point into leadership, and that's precisely where we see this first significant pinch point. In the move from individual contributor to manager, there's a 9% drop-off for women versus men, and from there, not surprisingly, that gap only gets bigger the higher you go. So when we look at the global picture, women make up about a half of entry-level roles, about a third of manager roles, and only about a quarter of senior leadership roles. So we're going from a half to a third to a quarter by the time we get to C-suite. And compounding that problem, our data shows that in 2021, men were on average 33%, so 1/3 more likely to receive an internal promotion versus women. One other trend I'd call out is that surge that we're seeing in women setting up their own businesses. This is a longer term trend that we've been seeing in the data over the past number of years, but that trend really took off 2 years ago in that first critical year of the pandemic. So in 2020, the share of female founders was up 45% on the previous years. Now, there's no question, but part of that increase was driven by the opportunities that the pandemic brought about for setting up new businesses and lowering setup costs, etc. But we can be very sure that many women were also forced to become what we call necessity entrepreneurs, having had their hands forced by economic headwinds, by inequitable workplaces, and frankly, unworkable working lives as they tried to juggle those additional care responsibilities along with their professional responsibilities. So all in all, Adrian, our findings make for a pretty sobering reading this morning, but crucially, they also shine a light on where some of these problems are emerging, and we hope will be a spur to action so that we can start to tackle some of those immediately.
Thanks, Sue. I think we can turn to one of Africa's leading economies, Nigeria, and hear from the minister there on what government is doing to really tackle this gender gap and how countries like Nigeria can help promote women in leadership. Minister.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Good morning, everyone. It's been a story of making progress and also regressing in our case. In our case, the COVID-19 really set us back. We had started with policies that were targeted at ensuring that women get a bit more of the economic activities, but COVID-19 set us back. But what we did to respond to the setback was, in our economic sustainability plan, we designed programs and made sure that there was a clear target to prioritize women by at least 50% in each of the packages that we prepared. So whether it is supporting small businesses, we made sure that 50% of the government interventions to those small businesses went to women. Whether it is public works, we made sure that women and girls were also taken along. In Nigeria, at the leadership level, if I give an example of the current Federal Executive Council, we have like 42 ministers and only 7 women. In the parliament, the proportion of women is just 4%, so we're not doing so well in terms of women representation and leadership. But we are seeing increasingly women going into entrepreneurship, so small businesses are going, and when government gives financing to women, the performance in terms of a repayment for finance is almost 99%. So women are the favorite for financial institutions to give financial support in terms of loans too, because they actually do well. And we also, the studies we've done shows that when you give funds to women, it actually has a direct impact on the family. The children fare better in school, they fare better in health, as opposed to when we provide the same kind of funding to men, the impact is not as well. So we've seen that an investment in women is actually, for us, a direct investment in the economy. The women form more than 50% of the population. They are the largest group that go out to vote for leaders in the country, but somehow we're still struggling with how to get more women into leadership positions, especially elective office positions. We've made sure that our budgets have an underlying principle of provisions, special provisions for projects that will have high impact on women and on girls, and also in the education sector, we've designed specific programs to encourage girls to finish at least what we call secondary school, because when a girl is up to 18, before she gets married, she takes care of herself and her family better. So there's a policy now that is beginning to evolve in states to make sure that a girl doesn't get married before the full age of adolescence, which is 18 years in our case. It's like I said, it's a mixed story. We see some progress in some areas, and then in some areas not doing so well. But it's generally now agreed that girls must be given priority, especially in education. And when you educate them, then they have a better chance of being better entrepreneurs and also have a better chance of getting into jobs and also keeping jobs and rising to managerial levels in the jobs that they handle. But it's interesting work that we're doing, and I like to say we're making progress.
Minister, thank you very much. Thierry Delaporte, we've heard there about some of the actions the government are taking. We heard from Sue Duke as well about some of the barriers that women face in the workplace. What can businesses really do to ensure that these barriers are removed? How can businesses, step up and help close this gap, which only seems to be getting wider through this pandemic?
Yeah, Adrian, thanks. Big question. And actually, let me start with one or two comments on, the study itself, and really great job to the team. I think it's fabulous to have data and really some real insight on, how things are, where things are, and, how far are we from, the objective. I find two things that I find completely striking. One, even the best country on earth is actually not meeting the balance, right? Even the best one. So it shows that this is a global issue. You may have some, towards, on top of the table, some are, lower, some are trending up, some are trending down, but everyone has to continue to work on it and close the gap. And I don't think we can wait for another 100 years. It's crazy. The second point that I find striking as a leader also is that, again, based on facts, if you look at what has happened over the last few years, small progress, small progress, small progress, and suddenly there is something macro that happens that change for some time, a little bit the focus and the priorities. Then by definition, we go back many years in our progression. Why? Unconscious bias. The reality is because suddenly we are not measuring actions based on these metrics, but on another one. And by definition, unconscious bias play to continue to aggravate the situation of gender balance. So that's for me two really, really big learnings that I take from this study. Your question about leadership and the businesses. My point is the following. As a lead, one, it must be leaders' agenda top priority. As simple as that. And in speaking, in action, and in results. You need everything. You need the speaking to address the unconscious bias, to really spread the rationale for why you're doing it. Again, fairness, efficiency, but also, I don't know a team, I've seen it many times in my career, a team that has the right balance, gender balance, is more likely to be a team that is creative, that is challenging status quo, that is innovative, right? That push boundaries, that connects more with others. Diversity brings better understanding of differences and is, at the end of the day, a better performing organization. So that is the reality. But to drive this, not only speaking, actions and outcome, it's very simple. My view is it's like, when you're sailing, the wind is sometimes tailwind, sometimes it's backwind. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, the responsibility of the leader is to drive outcome and make sure that every single day in its own organization, we are closing the gap. Now here comes the question of the speed of the gap. But in the way you are hiring people, in the way you are rating the performance of people, in the way you are promoting people, in your way you are giving roles to, at leadership level as well, you must make sure that the gap is reducing. It's as simple as that. In my organization at Wipro, we have 250,000 employees around the world. We have a gender balance of 36%, which is not right? There's no reason for that. It's been built over the years, but this is not a good reason. every single matrix is based on the fact that wherever you are as a leader, you need to move the needle and make sure that, and we can speak about it later, but on every of these metrics, the gap must widen every year. So no excuse allowed, just a focus on outcome.
Thierry, thanks very much. Before we take some questions, Sadia, can I just go back to you? There's no great secrets here about what it takes to close this gap. What are the very basic things that companies and governments can be doing to make sure that this is something that's tackled?
Yeah. A major area of investment for governments is care infrastructure. In the same way that governments think about physical infrastructure, they need to think about care infrastructure, health, childcare, elder care, broadly speaking, the education sector. Investments in these areas is better for families, but it is also much better for creating jobs, for example, and creating good jobs that can employ many, many millions of people across most economies. So there is a win-win there and a multiplier effect there that also helps close the gender gap. A second element is a big focus on the job-creating sectors of the future. Now, this is where a focus on science, technology, engineering, and math-related education would be critical when it comes to developing the pipeline of girls and women that can go into these professions in the future. And second, ensuring that the organizations that employ people into these roles are taking that bias out and ensuring that the full base of talent, women and men alike, are able to move into some of these roles. These are going to be the highest paid, fastest growing roles of the future, and we have to ensure there is a laser sharp focus there. And then the third element is the sectors that have suffered the most over the course of the pandemic, they also happen to be the ones that are some of the largest employers of women. So for example, retail, for example, travel and tourism, these are all sectors that were disrupted over the last few years and they haven't quite had a full recovery. And that is where some of the longer standing scarring of the labor market has taken place. And that is where there's some of the longest standing losses of women's employment. And again, there needs to be a stronger focus on either recovering those roles or reskilling and upskilling those women into other roles, into growing sectors in the future.
Thanks, Sadia. First question from Lucy White at the Daily Mail, and we are going to have some questions live, I think. This one is, do you think work from home policies risk setting women back if they work from home more than men due to childcare responsibilities? And maybe I can just share that round. And Sue, I can see that you look like you are working from home. What do you think, to Lucy's question, is this, are these policies actually working to the detriment of women's employment possibilities?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one we need to pay very, very close attention to make sure that working from home does not mean women taking on more of the care responsibilities that we saw them disproportionately assume during the pandemic. Sadia highlighted it, today's report reinforces it, that impact is still being felt. That double shift that women did throughout the pandemic is still having an impact on their careers. One of the key things here is we need to normalize flexibility for all workers, for men and for women, so that everyone has the ability to manage their care responsibilities in a way that works for them, for their families, and for their careers. And this is one of the critical opportunities that the crisis of the pandemic presents us. Flexible working is becoming a norm, not just for women, but across the board. In January 2020, right before the pandemic hit, 1 in 61 jobs on LinkedIn was a remote job. Today, it's 1 in 6. So if you go on LinkedIn today, 1 in 6 jobs is a remote job. And that gives us a huge opportunity to capitalize on this very fundamental shift in how work is organized, to make sure that it's organized in a way that allows us all to share responsibilities so that we can all share these opportunities in a much more equal way.
Thanks for that. We have Jamie Keaton on the line. I think if we can bring Jamie Keaton up from the Associated Press. Jamie, your question for the panel.
Good morning, Adrian. Good morning, Sadia. I had a couple of quick questions. One is following up on your question about what governments can do. I guess the question really is, are the governments doing that? I mean, I know we heard from Minister Ahmed who mentioned that, but overall, aside from Nigeria, I mean, are countries actually making good on their commitments? And what more really could they be doing? And then also talking about the gender, the care situation, the care infrastructure situation. Is there? Are you advising governments to sort of somehow compensate women who stay at home and care for children and care for the elderly, that kind of thing, which could have a really broad-ranging impact to help improve pay? And then finally, sorry, I'm going to add a quick third. Just in terms of the selection, you did mention that there's some numbers of countries that were not included this year among the 146, Russia, Syria, Iraq among them. Could you just explain a little bit about why some of those countries were kept out this year? Thanks.
That's a great triple-decker question. Right. Thank you, Jamie. Just to start perhaps with the most straightforward, it's usually data reasons that keep countries out of reports like this, ability to gather, ability to verify, ability to audit. Sadia, can we just begin perhaps first with the issue of governments generally? We heard from the minister about what Nigeria is doing, but are governments doing enough? You know, the evidence of the report seems to be that with this gap widening, there's a gap between what governments are talking about and what's actually happening on the ground. Is there a need for more action by governments?
Yeah. So on your piece on data, yes, absolutely. This is simply due to data availability, and we hope to continue to cover as many countries as we possibly can and add some countries back in the future when that data becomes available. On the piece on governments, I think when it comes to the care infrastructure, it's very clear that the only economies that are doing really well at this are the Nordic economies. They have actually put systems in place that make it possible for care to be better distributed in families and also to find other solutions that are socially funded when it comes to care. That's one area that other governments would do well in investing in, and it truly is an investment because it pays off. It allows more women to go into the workforce. The second element is removing basic barriers such as access to financial services, access to digital services. This is something that, particularly in developing countries, is going to be huge if they want to be able to integrate more women into the labor force. The third element is education. Now, interestingly, a lot of tertiary education gender gaps have either been closed or near closing in many parts of the world. But there are still too many persistent gaps when it comes to primary education and secondary education in many parts of the world. And that is critical. If we don't do that basic investment, then it's really impossible for those women to be able to go into higher paid, higher skilled professions into the future.
Sadia, thanks for that. And Thierry Delaporte from YPro, perhaps be interesting to hear from your perspective how business feels government is doing on this. Do you feel that governments around the world are supporting businesses like yours enough, or is there more that they could be doing, and are there some key actions that are missing?
Yeah, no, I think, Adrian, the reality is that it's very different from a country to another. I absolutely concur that, probably the Nordics countries have been ahead and have been leading. I suspect, I've not, I don't have the expertise of all the studies of the past, but I would not be surprised that they've led for many years already, because it's a culture, a global culture that is a lot more supporting this equality. And I think it drives one lesson, which is that it's not by 1, 2, or 3 or 5 measures. It's by a wealth of, different measures that you can really drive a real impact in the field. Whether it is in creating, so we talked about the work from home or the flexibility required. Let me tell you one thing, because I'm speaking to, small groups of, my organization every single week to collect their feedback and their views on what they would like the business world to evolve into in the future regarding that question. And what I'm hearing quasi-systematically from women is they like the fact that they can work from home. You know, they save on some commuting that is sometimes, long. They save on, and they can feel that they can organize themselves to manage the different priorities they have. It changes also the behavior of men who suddenly realize that they also have to play a role as well for the overall balance to work. And they also like the fact that they can come back to the office because they want to engage and meet with, colleagues and partners and clients. And so at the end of the day, the hybrid model is absolutely overwhelmingly chosen by the women, at least in my organization, but I hear it a lot from my clients as well. So it's clear. Now, how do we create this environment, right? Here is we need the help from governments in terms of, rules around equal pay, right? Is it acceptable legally that two persons in the same role are paid, with 30% gap? It's not. So if it's not, is it legal? Question. Some places are more, rigid than in some other places. We have a lot of discussion about, maternity and paternity leave, return to the office from maternity. What are the conditions? And so on and so on. Again, a lot more must be done by governance, but maybe my personal view is that, the leaders in the business can actually do most of the work to close the gap.
Thierry, thank you very much. Minister, we've got a couple more questions on the line, but just turning to you briefly. When you attend summits with fellow ministers, other leaders, is this issue of women's empowerment and bridging this gender gap part of your conversations, or is this still a kind of sideline conversation that's being had? Oh, Minister, I think we just need your audio.
I always make a point of trying to bring the issue to address that of women, but it's not necessarily mainstream into discussions that are held. So mostly you find that the issues of women are side meetings, which is really unfortunate, because if you mainstream the issue of women in every sector of the economy, then you find that there are very direct economic benefits for doing that. And in Nigeria, we actually took the pains to make sure that we provided, even in some of our laws, tax relief that was targeted at micro, small, medium enterprise. And the reason why we did that was because we found that the majority were women. And we didn't have big funds to give people during the COVID outbreak. So we thought tax relief was a good way to address small businesses. And women were the greatest beneficiaries. We designed registers to register the rural poor and the urban poor. 96% of those registers were women beneficiaries as caregivers of homes. So it has to be, like one of my colleagues in the panel, it has to be front and center. It has to be conscious. You have to do it deliberately. It won't happen by chance. We have to keep bringing it to the fore on a continuous basis, because the benefit affects children. We have a better educational outcome, better health outcomes, and also great economic benefits. So we need to continue to push for every aspect, whether it's agriculture. We have a program that we designed to give high-yielding seeds to women who choose to produce higher value crops rather than the low value crops that is just for consumption. So it has to be deliberate, and it has to be on a consistent basis.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Parvani Benu from the Hindu Business Line, your question, please.
Hi. Hi, I have a couple of questions. One from the data perspective. So do you think that adding or subtracting parameters that you've used to come up with these rankings, will it have an effect, will it change the ranking in case another parameter is added? The other question that I had was, our country has been, my country India has been consistently ranking low in a lot of indices that have come out recently, like the happiness index, the environment protection index. And there have been instances where the authorities have either rejected or criticized those reports. So do you think that that could be an outcome with the gender gap report as well?
Thanks for that. Good question. Sadia, obviously governments and businesses pay a lot of attention to reports like these, but do you and the team get any feedback from them on people slipping back or moving up?
Yeah. So the way we've constructed the index is try to take into account 14 key indicators that we think should apply globally, that can give us a very good picture of what is happening in each country when we look at this aggregated index. But in addition to that, we've got well over 30, nearly 40 other indicators that are provided for every single country to be able to develop a very complete picture in terms of what is happening on women and men, and specifically on gender gaps in economic, political, and other fields. Now that's the data piece of this. As to the attention that these rankings help draw, the main purpose here is to really call to governments, to businesses, to other leaders that more should be done in terms of closing the gender gap. The overall correlation between the economies that perform well in terms of competitiveness, in terms of productivity, those economies happen to be the very same ones that do well in terms of closing gender gaps. So there is a very clear incentive for governments to be able to do more. Now, when it comes to specific countries and how rankings are received, we are working with nearly 15 countries now on what we call the Closing the Gender Gap Accelerators. These are public-private collaborations sponsored by each government that are set up in various economies, large and small, that are trying to take this approach of accelerated impact on closing gender gaps. And there has been a lot of success. Our oldest accelerator so far is in Chile, and nearly 7% of the working women in that country have been impacted by that accelerator. Now, this translates into hundreds of thousands of women being supported through some of the work that has been done in those countries. So it's about a combination of data and policies that together can have the right kind of impact.
Sadia, thank you. And I think it's something that's worth remembering is these rankings are produced really as guidelines. They're not intended to shame countries. They're really just intended to offer guidelines comparatively how countries are doing. We've got Tim Cohen from the Daily Maverick in South Africa on the line. Tim, your question.
Hi everyone, thanks very much. I'm interested in the regional aspect of this, of the report. It's interesting to me that a bunch of developing countries are in the top 10. We in the developing world, we sort of used to being right at the bottom of these rankings, so it's kind of exciting that we've won, at least we are we're in the higher portion. But it does worry me a bit though, because my personal experience is that the formal institutions in some developing countries like parliaments and so on, the gender balance is pretty good. But really, if you look at society as a whole, it doesn't follow through at all. I just wonder if you could talk a bit about the regional differences between developing and developing countries. There's one other aspect of this that is also interesting. I thought you have mentioned before that the Scandinavian countries, have come very high on the list. I think, and we all know this that this has been a kind of, after a sustained kind of effort. But a lot of Scandinavian countries also have, and some European countries too, have specific requirements for the numerical balance on corporate boards. I just wondered whether you would encourage that as when you see the results, Should boards have, you know, a 50-50 parity requirement? Thanks very much.
Thanks for that. Maybe before I turn to Sadia, just to bring Sue Duke in. Sue, you know, LinkedIn spans an incredible number of different countries. Do you see some of what Tim reflected in your data when you look at developing versus developed economies?
We do see some of those divergences. So we do see that what Sadia said at the top of this session, those Nordic countries coming out quite strongly, some of those Western Europeans coming out strongly too, and some of those developing countries are certainly lagging further behind. But I think what is very clear is that there are systematic gaps across the board, and that we are not making sufficient progress. The progress we are making is very, very slow there. And as I said at the top of the session, Adrian, that means that right now, today, when it comes to female leadership, we do not have a single country and we do not have a single industry that has reached parity. So there are systematic challenges faced by women across the world, and there are key areas that the data points to that we need to start tackling immediately if those barriers are going to go away for women all across the world. Key areas like internal mobility, like equal hiring practices, and increased flexibility. Without those, women everywhere are going to continue to struggle to break through, and in particular struggle to break through to the highest ranks of corporate and government organizations.
Thanks for that. Sadia, just a quick reflection from you.
Yeah, so the index is constructed so that it is not tied to whether a country is rich or poor. What we're looking at is whether there is equality of access to opportunities. And when we look at the index that way, it's very clear that some countries from the developing world and the developed world are near the top, and countries from both the developed and the developing world are near the bottom. There are very rich countries that are towards the bottom of this index in the same way that there are developing economies that are in the top 10. So that's deliberately by construction, because we want to be able to see how countries are doing on closing that gender gap, regardless of whether they're rich or poor. And in fact, countries are going to get richer faster if they integrate more of their human capital, women and men alike. Now, that said, what is also clear is that when it comes to different regions, there's a very different pace at which they're reaching parity. So in North America, it will take 59 more years to get to parity at the current rate of change, 60 years when it comes to Europe, 67 years for Latin America, 98 years for Africa, 115 years for Middle East and North African region, 152 when it comes to Central Asia, 168 for East Asia, and finally South Asia, nearly 200 years. So things do look very different in different parts of the world, and that regional breakdown also gives you a sense of developing and developed regions.
Thanks for that, Sadia. And yeah, they do look very different and not good in any of those numbers. Time for a last question. Anand Ritzvi. Anand, your question, please. And could you just tell us where you're from?
Hi, it's Anam. I'm from the national newspaper in the UAE. So my questions are about sort of the MENA region. So in the last couple of reports, the MENA region ranked the lowest. And this year it's ranked second to last, with South Asia's ranked last. Are there any major reasons why there's a certain improvement, and also why it's still lagging behind? Aside from the general advice that you've given to sort of governments and organizations worldwide, are there certain things that governments and sort of companies in this region need to do, sort of focus on critically? The cost of living have really gone up in the past year in this region. So you say that the women are going to be hit the hardest. Now, what does the UAE government, what do authorities need to do to make sure that the women are, not impacted the worst?
Thanks for that. And I'll turn to Sadia on that. And then I just want to get a closing reflection, if I may, from each of our panelists, just on maybe the one thing that they would like to see prioritized to tackle this gender gap, so that we can have perhaps some more encouraging news to share next year. Sadia, just turning to you on that particular question.
Yeah, the big advantage in the Middle East region more broadly and more specifically in the Gulf countries is the huge investment that has taken place in women's education in the last 3 decades or so. In fact, it's been so successful that more women are coming out of university education than men in most of the Gulf countries. Now that investment getting converted into workforce gains is where the focus needs to be. And again, there has been a lot of progress. So for example, the UAE, countries like Saudi Arabia, they are doing fairly well in terms of closing the gender gap, the economic gender gap relative to their starting point some years ago. So there has been progress, but many more women need to go into leadership positions, and similarly when it comes to more political decision-making structures as well. So those are the 2 things that I think would have the biggest impact in terms of closing the gender gap in the region.
Thanks for that. And then perhaps if I can just turn to our panelists for a final reflection on this year's disappointing report in terms of its headlines. Minister, what's the one thing that you'd like to focus on in the year ahead on closing this gender gap? Oh, we just need you to unmute, Minister, if I could. Thank you.
For the next round of reports, that there should be an attempt to look at government's fiscal policies. We have been trying to mainstream gender parity in our fiscal policies in public financial management, because that is really at the macro level has a drill-down impact, and I think we should remember to always look at policies at that level. And also, when you have more women in strategic leadership positions in government, in the private sector, the programs and the projects that evolve and the policies will tend to become more balanced and also more gender neutral. So we should encourage governments at all levels in different places to look at gender parity as an wise economic decision to take and to implement.
Thanks, Minister. Thierry de la Porta of WIPRO, is there one key thing that you think you want to prioritise this year to help bring this gender gap down?
You know, leadership must show direction, and I think it always must come from the top. Tim Cohen referred to the fact that in some countries, the boards, there is a requirement for boards to have, balance between women and men. And guess what? It works. It works, and it's been done. Why don't we go and do the same for executive committee levels? And drive it the same way, and we will see a different dynamic in these teams with better performance.
Thank you, Thierry. And Sue, one last reflection from you. As we look at these numbers, is there one sort of key thing that stands out for you as something you'd like to see acted on in the year ahead?
Yeah, as you said, Adrian, the data, the findings, they are deeply disappointing, and we need to make some really big changes here if we are not going to continue to either inch forward with the progress we have made, or indeed if there are other shocks, if we are hit with economic headwinds or other headwinds, that we don't actually lose ground and go backwards. The data is extremely useful in shining a light on the specific areas where we're falling down. We need to get more women. We need to start bringing more women through the ranks within organizations. We need to start bringing more women from outside organizations into leadership roles. But flexibility for me is the big one. That will be the game changer. Our data shows that women are 24% more likely than men to apply for remote roles. And that really brings home just how crucial flexibility is for women, and just how crucial a role it will play for to level the playing field. So flexible working needs to be normalized. It needs to be normalized for men and for women if we're going to attract a diverse pool of talent, and if we're going to break this double shift that we've seen women assume, juggling professional and care responsibilities.
Sue, thank you. A big thank you to all of our panelists, Minister Ahmed for joining from Nigeria, Thierry de la Porte of WIPRO, to Sue joining us from LinkedIn. to all of you joining online, and my thanks to Sadia Zahidi and her team for preparing this year's Global Gender Gap Report. It's available online. Please check it out and see what you can do to help close that gap in 2022. Thanks from everyone here. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks very much.